The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
And hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show with me, Charles Christian. We've got a full programme, so unfortunately this week Janie has been pushed out and will be back with us next week. So what have we got? Well, we've got Halloween coming up, so appropriately enough, we've got one of our old friends, Naomi from Inannas in Norwich, to talk about Halloween or Samhain, as it's also known. But we start with an interview with Edward Parnell, and it's about his new book, Ghostland, and I think the best way to describe it is to read the blurb on the book, and it says, in Ghostland, Parnell goes in search of the sequestered places of the British Isles, our lonely moors, our moss-covered cemeteries, our stark shores, and our folkloric woodland. He explores how these landscapes conjured and shaped a kaleidoscope spectrum of literature and cinema, from the ghost stories and weird fiction of M.R. James, Arthur Machen, and Algernon Blackwood, through to the children's fantasy novels of Alan Garner and Susan Cooper. From W.G. Sebald's The Rings of Saturn and Graham Swift's Waterland to the archetypal folk horror film The Wicker Man. And it is. I've read the book from cover to cover. One of the first books I've read from cover to cover for a long time. Thoroughly a good read, and to an extent gives you an itinerary if you want to travel around the British Isles to look for weird places. We go into Ed Parnell's interview shortly, and then after that it's Naomi. And before I forget, next week, make a note, we have Maxine Sanders, an interview with her. She rarely gives interviews. She's the legendary co-founder of the Alexandrian witchcraft movement in the 1960s. Now, on with the show. We're here to talk about Ghostland, In Search of a Haunted Country. Now, there's a personal story running through it, but in the process of it, you look at the landscapes and terrains associated with ghost stories, horror stories, legends of the UK. What was your initial attraction to this whole idea? A sort of a semi, because it's not sort of saying go to this place and you'll see a ghost, but it's really go to this place and this is the land that a writer of ghost stories was influenced by.
I think the easiest way to explain it might be to talk about how the book came to pass, really, which I've written one previous book, which is quite a gothic novel set in Norfolk in 1940 called The Listeners, and that came out a few years ago, and I was messing around, really not writing the next book, thinking of what I was going to do, and I had an idea for a novel that I quite like the idea because I'm obviously into ghost stories and all of this sort of thing. I had an idea about having M.R. James appear as a minor character in a sort of late Victorian set novel in Cambridge, or at least part of it. So to look into that, I went to the little village where he grew up, just outside Bury St Edmunds, Great Livermere, because I'd heard quite a lot about it, and I went with a friend of mine who's a a documentary maker called Clive Dunn, not the Dad's Army Clive Dunn, and he'd made a documentary about M.R. James several years ago for Anglia TV. So I went with him because he knew all of the various spots, and I just was really just intrigued just to see the place, and I like poking around old churchyards, and there's this amazing kind of ephemeral lake that sits there, which is also a spot I was familiar with from my kind of bird watching past, because it's somewhere where there's been various rare birds previously. So that the one that stuck in my mind was a black-winged pratincoll, which is a weird European wading bird that looks more like a hawk than a wader. That my brother had seen one there, I don't know, 15 years ago or something, probably longer than that, and I hadn't got to see it, so I was always a bit jealous. So I knew the place for that. Anyway, I went to Livermere, and then actually went back a couple of times on my own as well, and just really loved it as a place. It's quite a creepy place. There's M.R. James's old house, the rectory where his father was based, where James lived as a young boy. He wasn't born there, he was born in Kent. And that's got this walled garden that might actually, the wall and the gate in it features in his one potentially autobiographical story, a vignette, which was the last story published during his lifetime. That's sort of by the by, but it's just quite a creepy place. So you've got this sort of walled garden of the big rectory, then the land slopes down to this strange lake. There's the sort of the church next to it, and then there's a ruined church over the other side of the lake that's now no longer in use. And there was also used to be a big sort of local country house that's also was demolished, I think, at some point, possibly in the 20s, something like that. So that would have been there when James was a boy. So you can see how that landscape fed into lots of his stories. I mean, something like Lost Hearts. Yeah. You've got a mere in there, the sort of, when he talks about the weird noises coming from the birds, from the lake. Yeah. Parkland houses, in the Suffolk countryside, they're in several stories.
Is that the one as well that you spotted some mother souls in the cemetery there, the graveyard there, which is obviously from the ash tree, which again, country house and
exactly
very much Suffolk country house.
Yeah, so Castringham Hall in the ash tree, that's set in the Suffolk countryside, and I think this is something that James did. He liked to sort of pick names from graveyards. He does that when you walk around I think it's St Peter's Church in Livermere. There's several mother souls. That was clearly a local family name that he then used to great effect with Mrs. Mother Soul and her There Will Be Guests at the Hall, and the horrible kind of spidery revenge that is enacted. But I know when I was researching the book down in Devon at a little village called Sanford Courtney, which is the non-disguised setting for a story called Martin's Close. It's just on the edge of Dartmoor. There's several of the surnames in that story you could find in the graveyard. Oh, right. So he may do it in other stories as well. I'm not sure, but it's certainly something he liked to do. Anyway, I was wandering around Livermere and did all of this research. Went home. I had lots of photos. Wrote a sort of a little piece on my website about it, and probably a month or so later, I got an email from an editor at HarperCollins asking whether I'd ever thought he found it really interesting. Had I ever thought about writing a non-fiction book on this subject? And of course, I was kind of all over that. And I went down at some point, a little while after, and we got on really well. I went away to think about whether I'd want to write such a book, how I would do it. And out of that, Ghostland was born.
I know you probably need to, you may need to refer to the book, but a lot of who are the writers that you include in the book? You've mentioned M.R. James.
There's lots of people in there. So there's I suppose the more obvious writers of ghost stories and eerie weird fiction. So there's James, Algernon Blackwood, E.F. Benson, Walter de la Mare, Amias Northcote. They're some of the sort of, I guess, the writers we would know for their ghost stories, and they're all from that sort of, I guess they were writing in around about that Edwardian era or just after. But there's also people like lots of writers back then, actually writing ghost stories wasn't a niche thing. Lots of quite famous writers dipped in and would write the occasional ghost story. If you look at, obviously there's somebody like Henry James or Edith Wharton, they were very good ghost story writers. Being American, I don't really go into them particularly in the book. I think Henry James may be mentioned, but there's other writers like Rudyard Kipling or Conan Doyle, and I think they had, I talk about them in some detail, but as well as those figures, there's lots of that kind of haunted generation TV that I grew up watching in the, I guess for me it would have been the late 70s, sort of early mid 80s. Lots of that weirdness that surrounded us. So things like there was a BBC adaptation, I think around about 1985, of The Children of Green Know that really struck me. I was probably a bit too old to be watching it because I think it was aimed at slightly younger kids, but it was quite haunting. So Lucy Boston, who wrote those books, she's in there. There's also...
Yes, I've just read the bit on Lucy Boston and the property she used to live in.
Yes.
Which was...
Hemmingford Grey Manor, which is... I think it's reputedly they say that it's the oldest continually inhabited house in the country. That may be hard to verify, but it's certainly... It's a very old, quite a strange house. And...
you had a strange experience there when you were being shown around it.
I did. So the house is now... it's owned by Lucy Boston's daughter-in-law, Diana, and she very kindly showed me round. And basically, the house is a sort of character in its own right in the series of children's books, the Green Know books that Lucy Boston wrote in the sort of 50s into the 60s, I think. The first one being The Children of Green Know. And yes, so you can walk around the house and you will recognise features from it. And actually, there's even things like the little carved wooden mouse that Tolly, the main character, he takes great comfort in. That's actually there. And we went up, so that there's a really nice music room where during the war, Lucy Boston put on concerts for locally based airmen, and they would, I think, come, and it must have been a really nice setting to get away from the chaos of their own precarious futures. And there's a huge gramophone that's still there that looks like something out of His Master's Voice that sort of dominates the room. But you can picture them all there, sat there. There's a little set of stairs that goes up from that into the attic, which was the bedroom that Tolly, when he comes to the house in the books, and it's all really quite magical, the arrival in this flood, he's sort of in a strange place. Here's his room up in the attic. There's a big rocking horse in there, which is still there. So Diana was showing me around. Here's the rocking horse. This is the chest that Tolly looks in. All these things I remember from the books. And then a book, seemingly out of the corner of my eye, flew, I would say, a couple of feet from the shelf onto the floor, and her little terrier that was following us around went across and sniffed it and sort of, all right, that's that then. And I sort of, asked, well, what happened there? And she was, these things happen here sometimes. And I just picked the book up and was, very, very casual about it. Later, reading more of Lucy Boston's autobiography, she refers to all of these poltergeistic happenings being an absolutely commonplace feature in the house and objects moving. And actually, when I later went back to visit to take some photos, sort of probably about a year later, I recalled this incident to Diana, who didn't remember it at all. So clearly it was something that didn't seem out of place. But she was saying that, yes, there's been people who, when they've come to stop, they don't like staying in that room and various things. So I'm quite a skeptic of of ghosty things, but I'm I'm not a non. I don't not believe. I think,
Yes.
and I have no rational explanation for what went on there. I don't think this wasn't a book that just was teetering on the edge and our footsteps knocked it off. This was, we'd been in the room for a couple of minutes and there seemed to be, at least out of the corner of my eye, a reasonable movement. So who knows what was. I'm sure there's some sort of rational explanation, but it was certainly good for it was actually that was before I was actually writing the book when this happened. So I was actually just on a visit there just because I'd always wanted to go. So it wasn't something I've concocted to add some colour.
One of the things you do in the book, where possible, is you visit the actual houses or homes of the people featured, and if possible, get in and have a look around. How successful were you on that? Because you do make the point that just bowling up and knocking on the door and saying, "Hey, I'm a writer, can I look round this house?" doesn't go down too well with some people, but with others, with Hope Hodgson, for example, you were welcomed in and you found yourself with somebody who knew all about it.
Yeah, so that was one of my highlights actually from when I was researching the book. So William Hope Hodgson, who is this writer of weird fiction from the pre the First World War. I think his best novel, The House on the Borderland, was probably written whilst he was living in a little tiny coastal Welsh town called Borth, little bit north of Aberystwyth. Mm-hmm. So I was in Wales investigating him. I'd also been sort of investigating Arthur Machen and Alan Garner as well on the same trip. But I turned up in Borth just thinking, well, this is one of the few places where there's a sort of tangible link to him because there's a memorial there to him. And I thought, well, you never know, I might be able to. I know the name of the house that he wrote or at least the foreword to the book in, because he names it in this sort of little editorial trick he does in the book with this sort of introduction. So the house is named there. I turned up thinking, I'm never going to find this. It's more than 100 years on. No chance. It was a nice day. It was an early spring day. I bought an ice cream because there was a nice little cafe and I'd had quite a long drive. Thought, now I'll have a wander along the street, see what I find. Bought the ice cream. Oh, there it is. And then sort of had to think, right, well, am I going to go and sort of cold call and see what happens? But I wandered round to the back of the house, which was directly onto the beach. Mm-hmm. And I knew this was something I knew actually from other articles I'd read about it. So it was a clue as to why I was looking on that side of the road. And there were some people in the garden. So once I'd finished my ice cream, I sort of gingerly wandered over and sort of asked them whether they knew about an author who used to live in their house. And I had my whole spiel ready. And of course, oh yeah, you want to talk to Anthony, my husband, William Hope Hodgson. Oh yes. And then Anthony came down, who was a really lovely bloke, and invited me inside, interrupting his rugby viewing. And he had all sorts of William Hope Hodgson books and articles that he'd acquired. He when he moved in, he didn't know anything about the link to it. He was from Borth and had moved back, I don't know, 20 years ago or something. And then other villagers had said, "Oh, you're living in the William Hope Hodgson house," and then there's no blue plaque or anything, which is a shame, I'm sure. But he'd then done his own research and read the books. But that was really quite magical to me, being in that room, thinking, I'm potentially in the room looking out over the beach where this quite obscure figure used to walk with his sister, where he potentially wrote this really quite strange, remarkable novel that has elements of H.G. Wells's The Time Machine. So that worked really well. In other places, I chickened out or didn't do it. So also in Wales, in Snowdonia, one of my favourite books is Alan Garner's The Owl Service, which he wrote in a place called Bryn Hall, in this tiny little sort of village just sort of in this valley. And that looked quite... it didn't look very welcoming from the outside. I didn't see that you had to have gone up a drive, and I chickened out from going to ask, because I didn't really get any sense that they would appreciate me going. And I kind of, I don't think there's not a magical thing to doing this that I somehow then discern something from but I think it was certainly with the house on the borderland, there was a house that is mentioned in the book. It just seems right to do. And other places I did it as well. So yes, at Hemmingford Gray, and I also visited Kipling's house and various different people. But
yeah. Did you have any other experiences of the Hemmingford Gray variety? Things jumping off walls? Or any places you went to that were particularly atmospheric, spooky?
There were lots of atmospheric places I visited. I think I particularly liked, I was the only person on the Grey Hill just north of Newport in South Wales, which I think kind of ties in with some of Arthur Macken's work. And there's an old stone circle up there that's so that felt quite magical to be up there. The first time I tried to go, there was a really low mist and it was horrendous. So I turned back and came back the next morning when it was quite a nice day. But I was surprised once I'd got up there that there wasn't anyone else around. So that kind of felt like that had an atmosphere about it, and lots of places were like that. As to other slightly odd incidences, there are a couple more in the book, but they happened earlier. They're things I'm remembering back to, so I'll be enigmatic about it and let people read about them. They didn't actually happen whilst I was researching it. The one that happened was at Hemmingford Gray.
Yeah, right. Again, you've mentioned England and Wales. Do you cover Scotland in there in the book?
I go to Scotland. I mean, I don't know whether I cover it. It's obviously it's quite a long book as it is, and we cut quite a lot from it. It would have been another 40,000 words if we'd have submitted which is, I don't know, another 200 pages if we'd submitted the first draft. But I think lots of that stuff. Yes, that's for part 2, is exactly,
it? That's the sequel.
The director's cut. There's some interesting, probably standalone articles, and that's probably why lots of that stuff went, because actually it was stuff I was exploring, was really interested in, but maybe didn't quite chime with the overall kind of theme of all of these haunted writers, really, I think, which is, and my own kind of haunted past. I think that's the thing that ties lots of these characters and the choices of people I looked into together. But Scotland I visited. There's a whole chapter really on the Wicker Man and quite a lot of Robert Burns. So yes, that's all in there. There was some other stuff that more up in the Highlands that didn't make it in the end. I mean, I did actually visit Aleister Crowley's old burnt down house on the shores of Loch Ness, which possibly involved some walking over a field that I shouldn't have done to get to it to look at. So in the end, I didn't include that in the book. But that was an eerie location. There's all sorts of, obviously with Crowley, there's all sorts of devil worshipping sort of mythic stories that happen. But actually, in the end, I kind of thought it's not really. It was interesting to see, but I didn't quite think it didn't really fit in with the content of the book. And actually, I don't think he's, as a kind of he did write some supernaturally tinged short stories, but they're not really of the same ilk of these kind of things, I don't think.
Yes, he was more living the
dream.
Living the dream of supernatural.
He's mentioned there's a chapter on Cornwall where he sort of makes a brief appearance because he was involved allegedly in various shenanigans, which I'm sure he was quite happy to have people think he was involved in that it all added to his mystique of the great beast and all of that. So yes.
And of course that house is now burned down yet again. About 6 weeks ago.
Did it? Okay.
Yes.
I knew it was up for sale.
It was up for sale, and it mysteriously burned down shortly after it changed hands. So.
Oh, right. Well, there wasn't very much of it left when I saw it.
There's even less now. Right. Could you use this book if you were so inclined for doing a road trip?
I'd like to think you could. Certainly, I think there's been a reviewer who's who sort of called it a gazetteer of these kind of places. So it takes in quite a... It's not exhaustive. It's not a book where you would look up, Bedfordshire, I need to go here. It doesn't work like that. I mean, the places I chose are, which will become apparent if and when people read it, that there was this strange kind of coincidence that there's lots of sort of personal family links really, which sort of drove most of the choices of the places I visited in the book. But there's still, there's a wide geographic spread. There's quite a lot of East Anglia in there, and Lincolnshire and the Fens where I grew up, quite a lot of the southwest, Cornwall, Dorset, Scotland, quite a lot of Wales, Cheshire. So it's not exhaustive. I mean, if you bought it thinking, right, where am I going to go and see in the northeast, you'd be disappointed, sadly. But maybe part 2 there could be some of these other places that were missed. Who knows?
Of the places you visited, or of the writers you mention in it, which were the ones that struck you the most or made the most impression on you?
Well, there are obviously writers like M.R. James, who I came to being a big fan of and being very familiar with his work. But then in the course of it, so I was writing a chapter about the Fens, as I say, which is where I grew up in South Lincolnshire, which to many people, that sort of flat, big skied landscape is itself quite eerie. To me, I'm not sure it is, because I'm quite familiar with it. And I think maybe that's a lot of what people find discomforting in landscapes might be things that they're unfamiliar with. So for me, I might now find living in Norfolk's not flat, it's a misconception, but it's not hilly or mountainous. So if I go to a mountainous area, that might seem slightly more magical or odd to me, because it's not within my everyday vista. And I think certainly the Fens, I wonder, and like say the marshes of the Norfolk coast, where lots of ghost stories are set in those kind of landscapes, certainly Jamesian ones. But I wonder whether people who aren't from that sort of really quite empty, open skied world, whether that seems sort of quite disconcerting. So for me, it's not particularly. But anyway, I've digressed. Yeah. But within that chapter of the Fens, I happened upon an author, because actually I sadly saw his obituary in the Eastern Daily Press whilst I was writing it, John Gordon, known as Jack Gordon to his family, who wrote a wonderful novel, his second novel, called The House on the Brink, which is essentially set around Wisbech. The House on the Brink refers to Peckover House, which is the National Trust property, or at least a version of that. Yeah. But that's a wonderful novel. It's often thought of by sort of scholars of M.R. James as being one of the best novels in his tradition. So obviously James wrote short stories, and it's a children's novel. To me, it's very like, or it evokes Alan Garner, particularly something like The Owl Service. He's got a very savvy sort of teenage protagonist who's kind of quite a romantic sensibility, sort of biking around the Fens. And I think I wish I'd read it when I was that age, because it would have chimed with me, definitely, I think, sort of moodily biking round and this odd landscape. But that really struck me, because it was someone I wasn't at all familiar with. And I've read subsequent of Jack Gordon's novels, which are also very good. So that was nice to happen upon a new writer. But there were just so many writers, different films, even artists I talk about, sort of Paul Nash, somebody like that, and actually particularly in relation to the Dorset chapter that I took near the end of the book, there were just lots of people I may have been slightly aware of, I got to explore further, who really struck with me. And
any standout locations? I mean, I know you mentioned Lincolnshire. That's your sort of home turf originally. Where was probably the most evocative place you visited? I think that certainly the
the location where the Wicker Man was filmed, which is in Dumfries and Galloway, on the coast, right sort of at one of the tips there of the coastline. So it takes an absolute age to get there. It's quite interesting because you go up there, and obviously the Wicker Man, Summer Isle, you have this sort of filmic geography when you're watching the film, and you completely buy into that it's on this little Hebridean island, and they didn't film it. The opening shot, I think, which is the sergeant flying over in his seaplane, I think there's some aerial footage of flying over Mull, I believe. Yeah. But actually they filmed it on the mainland at various different locations around Dumfries and Galloway. So yeah, there's the wonderful churchyard, Amworth Churchyard. That was one of my favourite locations because it's exactly as it is in the film when Edward Woodward's character turns up and finds this sort of churchyard gone to seed and all these kind of signs of paganism there. That was a wonderful place. The actual site itself, the headland where they actually constructed the Wicker Man itself, although there were two. There was a smaller one for some of the other different shots, but there's still the stumps of where they're set into concrete, where the smaller of the two was built. That was quite a sort of grim sort of, I think it was a late March day when I was there. Well, it was just cold. It wasn't raining or anything, and it's quite an odd place because you get to you drive for absolutely ages. You go through this sort of end of the world caravan park, and then sort of walk to the headland, and there in the distance is the Isle of Man and various different sort of things you can see on the horizon. But that was quite a mystical place, and the little cave round the corner that's St Ninian's Cave, that has sort of local sort of religious and folkloric. It's a bit of a place of pilgrimage, I think, now. But actually that in the film is where Woodward's taken at the end of it, just before his sort of fateful ending. He sort of runs up through there. That was another interesting location. So I really enjoyed that, and Burns's churchyard, they were great. The places in Wales that, say, Hope Hodgson, that was really interesting. The valley for where the owl service was set in, that was one of my favourites. And yeah, just so many actually. It's hard to pick.
Is there anything, now you've finished it, and no, not merely finished it, it's published, sitting there in front of us, anything you would have done differently? The benefit of hindsight?
It's hard to say, really. I think I'm quite happy with how it turned out. Yes, I suppose I might have been that I could have tried harder to get access to the house that the owl service is. I'm not sure how I would have done that, but something like that would have been potentially nice. But I don't really think it would impinge greatly on the sort of narrative I was trying to piece together, really. So no, I'm reasonably happy with it. Yeah. And
it's out now. Came out what?
Came out last week.
Last week,
we had a book launch, a really nice book launch event in Norwich at the Book Hive, which is a wonderful little independent bookshop.
What are you going to be doing over the next few weeks in terms of promoting it? Are you going to be doing readings or?
Yeah, well, I've just spent the last weekend actually in the Midlands in Leicestershire in a purportedly haunted hotel, Bosworth Hall, I was invited to chair a panel. There's the relaunch of the Usborne World of the Unknown Ghosts book, which was quite a sort of a formative book for me growing up, or actually that and its sequels. Came out, I think, the original one in 1977. Yes. I think I would have come to it a little bit later, a year or two after that, I think. But certainly lots of I was obsessed. I should say that I was obsessed with ghosts, not goats, from a very young age, from really as early as I can remember. I think there was maybe dinosaurs first, but then it was ghosts. We went on family holiday when I was about 4 to Wales, and I remember afterwards it sort of became a bit of sort of family folklore that I was there asking the tour guide whether there are any ghosts, is this bit haunted, all of this sort of stuff. And then I was fairly obsessed with ghosts. So I think finding these Usborne books, that would have certainly fueled my love of all of that. And I particularly liked the one which was on vampires and werewolves and demons, which was a slightly later one that hopefully might also get reissued. But yes, I was at this hotel in the Midlands chairing. We had the writer of that and lots of other people who'd been inspired by those books. So that was really nice to have an introduction, or to be reintroduced to that book again. I'm doing a couple of events in Norwich. Hopefully there will be some more at other places around the country as and when, but they're to be confirmed at the minute.
And any favourite stories in the book?
Well, I like most of M.R. James's repertoire. I think, off the top of my head, he had about 30 or so of his kind of major published stories during his lifetime. So and they're all pretty good. I mean, they vary a bit. There's some that I think retread the same ground, but generally they're all...
The Metzertint and the Haunted Doll's
House. Yeah, and he even admits that.
Yeah.
And I think actually A Warning to the Curious is a little bit of a rehash of A Whistle, I'll Come to You. A little bit. So... But I love James's work. In terms of other stories that I read, and I think Algernon Blackwood's The Willows is, for sheer atmosphere, even though it's set in the Danube. So, but I talk
that's
about
the one on the island, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes, this sandy island that's gradually getting eroded. That's a fantastic story, and is certainly one of my favourites. And I do manage to talk about it quite a lot in the book, because I sort of relate that landscape to that weird fens landscape that I grew up in, and some of the sort of poplar plantations that's in my book. But other things, so the story They by Rudyard Kipling, I think, is a really poignant story. It's essentially, I think it's a story he wrote after he lost his daughter when she was 4 or 5, just after the turn of the century. But that's a wonderful ghost story that I hadn't read before. So yeah, there's a few there that Amius, I can never pronounce his name. I never know if it's Amius or Amius Northcote's Bricket Bottom, he was a sort of contemporary of M.R. James. He also went to Eton like James, and he wrote one collection of stories called In Ghostly Company, which I think came out round about 1920, something like that. But there's a story in there that's in quite a lot of ghost story anthologies called Bricket's Bottom, that's set in this little sort of wooded glade, that again is a story that's quite unsettling. I think if you're walking around the woods on your own, and if you happen to spot an old house in the woods, that's one that is very good. And I'm a sucker for old houses in the woods, because my novel The Listeners is really sort of playing on the house in Walter de la Mare's poem The Listeners. And Walter de la Mare's stories, he wrote lots of, I hesitate to call them ghost stories, they're very weird sort of stories. I think they're fantastic. They're, well, in that sense as well, but they're I think they're harder to pin down than James's sort of horrors. They're probably more psychological and just really quite elusive in what he's doing, but they're very strong for all of that. I think he's sort of like a forerunner, if people are familiar with Robert Aikman's stories. They're kind of an earlier version of that, but I certainly would read some of Walter de la Mare's short ghost stories as well. Yeah.
Right, putting you on the spot, what's your favourite M.R. James story?
Well, it's quite a difficult question to answer, because I think it's sort of they shift a little bit, and there'll be times when I read one and it might sort of have more resonance at that moment, and I think, yes, I think this one's my favourite. I like the obvious ones. I think the Mezzotint's really very good. And A Whistle, yes. A Warning to the Curious, I love the I love the BBC adaptation, the Lawrence Gordon Clark adaptation of that, which I think maybe on balance for me sort of shades the actual story, because it's kind of one of the later James stories. But there's other ones that I enjoy a lot, like the Residence at Whitminster, I think it is. That's the one that has this weird sort of young man, Lord Saul, who comes to stay and is obviously tied up with lots of dark forces. That's one I like a lot. Casting the Runes, and then obviously a lot of them are kind of tied up with their adaptations. So I'm a big fan. I like Night of the Demon a lot as well. So there's all of that going on, and particularly Lost Hearts. That was my introduction to James, seeing the BBC Christmas ghost story when I came back from the pub on Christmas Eve, sort of aged about 20, and flicked the telly on, and there it was, this horrific sort of the hurdy-gurdy boy with his razor-clawed fingernails and his... that was really sort of my first introduction to James. So that, and indeed the story, they always stick with me. Although Lost Hearts, the actual story, is, I think, a little bit atypical of James, and James himself didn't like it, thought it was a bit of a sort of a grubby story, I think, but I still quite like that as well.
What about Canon Alberic's scrapbook?
Yeah, they're also good, aren't they? A View from the Hill. It's... there's probably about 10 or so that it's hard to separate, actually. And then there's a few of the others, like the Haunted Doll's House is... I think James, it's still a good story. James admits, though, it's kind of a rehash of the Mezzotint. So that's probably, we've seen him do that before, so it's perhaps not quite as good. But some of the horrors in Count Magnus, that's another that's got to be up there. So I think I could debate with myself about it for hours. So who knows?
Well, Edward, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
Hello, Charles. It's lovely to chat with you again on what is now a dark autumn evening. Yes, here we are approaching what in Celtic tradition was the ending of the old year, the turning of the wheel, and then the beginning of the next year's magical cycle. And yes, Samhain, there are a few different ways to pronounce, and once again we can avoid it all by simply calling it Old Year's Night. I think for many of us, the idea that this is the final gathering in of the harvest is a key thought. That having begun that harvesting process in the heat and intensity of the end of July and turning of August, and moved through August into September and those hot and golden days that we had, and the furious busyness of beginning to see seeds, nuts, fruits, berries ripening and plumping, and then through September into October and seeing leaves beginning to turn and the colours of autumn foliage, and again the fullness of harvest at the autumn equinox, that green acorns were turning to brown and green conkers were filling out, and walking along the pavement and seeing those gleaming, shining brown conkers inside those bright white, pith-lined green casings, and knowing that school would be coming back in and holidays were coming to an end, and that yet it was also a beginning of things that we talked about at the equinox. So now here we are at the finality, the culmination, all gathered in. If you haven't got it by the end of October, you ain't got it. So it's time to say, what do we have and what do we feel about it? And what satisfaction and enrichment has it given us? And what preparation for winter? The storing of things, canning and juicing and preserving and salting and brining and pickling and, all of that to nourish and sustain, but also emotionally to think, what have I learned, what have I grown with, what have I achieved and accumulated, and then also what do I want to let go of, what do I want to leave behind in the old year. And with that symbolism also of the veil parting, drawing thin and parting, and communication with the other world, we have both that idea of our release and letting go in order to have fresh, new, as the New Year cycle begins in November, but also the idea of remembrance. Remembrance of those that we love who are no longer here, remembrance of times past, remembrance of pleasures enjoyed, of meals and feasts shared, of travel and experiences added to our body of knowledge and our life tapestry, and to think about those that we miss. It's my birthday at this time of year, and I think when it comes along, I think to myself how much I've achieved or learned or grown or experienced through the year's cycle, but also very much the thought of family, of animals and beloved pets that aren't here anymore, as well as human beings. I think it's remembrance and celebration of that is very meaningful to me. I think about my grandparents, gone but not forgotten. I think of dear friends of mine, gone but not forgotten. I think of beloved animals that I've loved, gone but not forgotten. And that's something that I think people feel very emotional about. I used to run a celebration at this time of year. For about 10 years I hosted an evening where we would gather together, think of what we'd worked through the year, let go of what we wanted to release, and imagine what the next year might bring in. And one of the most poignant parts of those evenings, which I hosted, was the saying of the names as we lit a candle of people that we loved and missed. And being told by one or two of them that was the only time of year that their husband or wife or child might have been named aloud and remembered. So I think that's a key thing as we move through this time of the year and we come into the dark part of the year and minimal sunlight and minimal warmth, that we embrace that thought of light within ourselves, light within the memory for others, and sustenance, that those are memories that can keep us embraced by love and embraced by friendship. So I think those are two very key areas for me for this time of year.
Can you just explain a little bit about the end of the year, start of the year for people who tend to think January is the start of the year? What the context, the historical context is?
Well, yes, it is a mix of things, isn't it? Because in our modern calendar, we think of January the 1st as being the start of the new year, and the associations that January has with Janus, the face that looks back and the face that looks forward, and that timing being Roman, and winter solstice being beginning of new solar year. So you have, leading up to the winter solstice, the sun being above the horizon less and less, and then after the solstice, and I know that there are slight adjustments with being precise on that, but certainly is a symbolic idea that after the solstice the light gets a little stronger each day, the sun rises a little higher, we feel we've kind of come down as far as we can go, and we start to come up again, and there is almost that kind of palpable, tangible feeling of we've come through. So that's the solar year, but this is the magical year, the last of the harvest festivals. So if we think about the solstices and the equinoxes, summer solstice, autumn equinox, in between halfway, Lammas, Lughnasadh, beginning of harvest. And then from the autumn equinox to the winter solstice, the halfway point being this. Mm-hmm. So the timing being set perhaps by being in between the fullness of harvest and the coldness of winter solstice, that we're halfway between that point. So it's still that movement. And then with the idea of ending and new beginning, that tradition cuts across a number of different cultures. So you think Day of the Dead in South America, and you think there are other cultures and heritages that would mark the midpoint between the autumn equinox and the winter solstice. So I would say that there are a number of endings and beginnings. And of course, different heritages will have their different celebrations. Hanukkah will be around Christmas this year. As we move into January and on towards February, festivals of Candlemas and Imbolc and Coming of Light. Chinese New Year is second new moon in February. April will bring its New Year for the Sikh tradition. So there are endings and beginnings always, but I suppose what I feel about Samhain is that it's heralding that journey that we now move into the deepest, darkest time of the year, that the earth itself rests, that it's an earth festival. It's crone, it's grandmother, it's elder wisdom, and it's a time of storytelling, a time of shared gathering together. There's not much to do outside. If you're farming your fields, there's only the hope that the weather will be kind, that what you've preserved will sustain. And so the focus on things like poetry and song and storytelling and divination also. And think how a lot of the ancient divination tools were things like hazelnuts. So again, it's sort of harvest and nourishment and thoughts of grain that will sprout in the new year, flowers that will come in the new growing year, in the new agricultural year, in the new seeding and sprouting time. So this time is that assessment, and also heritage. And again, because you're thinking of ancestors and your own family heritage, it's when people might sit together and look through family photo albums and, oh, do you remember that? Oh, that holiday, I'd forgotten that. Oh, that was when great uncle so-and-so was around. And, it's that shared connection. I think that's why shared stories and tales and songs and all the kind of the old poems and stories of different cultures are so precious. It's the perfect time to be sharing that, sharing food together, sharing laughter together, sharing memories together. And if on one's own, one can do that too. But it's lovely to be able to get together with others and share that.
And talking of storytelling, you are yourself doing some storytelling activities coming up shortly.
This is something I began a year ago, and I'm so delighted that people have come along and understood what I was trying to do. I've been doing what I would call performed readings, stories that I've grown up loving and some that I've found that are more contemporary that I thought people would enjoy. For adults, but perhaps for children also who would enjoy sitting and listening. The idea being that shared listening is a rather beautiful activity. It doesn't depend on somebody showing you the visuals. You can imagine them for yourself. So what I've done is I've set up a couple more evenings, 2nd of November and 9th of November, at the Norwich Puppet Theatre. And all the money raised will go to the Puppet Theatre's own charity fundraising. And I'll be reading selections of stories that I've known and loved and in some cases grown up with, themed around the turning of the year, the parting of the veil and the connecting with fairy, and the welcoming of ghost ancestors in one or two of the stories, the idea of us walking between the worlds, and that there is connection between this world and other worlds at this time of year. So yes, all the details can be found on the Norwich Puppet Theatre website. And what I've done is set it up as though we are sitting in a Victorian living room. Mm-hmm. So with an armchair and a rug and a lamp and the storybooks on my knee.
Thank you ever so much. That was lovely.
Thank you, and I wish everybody a blessed Samhain.
And that's it. We're out of time. One last little short piece. You may have spotted it. It's the character in Salem, Massachusetts, which is an appropriate enough location. A certain Rick or Mortis Schreck, who is a tattoo artist and collector of Ouija boards, has just completed the construction of the world's largest Ouija board. It's called Ouija-zilla. It comprises 99 individual sheets of plywood covering a total area of 3,168 square feet. Apparently, you can park 5 full-size 18-wheelers on top of it and still have room to spare. As for the planchette, that is 15.5 feet in length and 10 feet wide at its widest point and weighs roughly 400 pounds. I suppose the question you have to ask is, what kind of monster spirit are they trying to raise with the world's biggest planchette and Ouija board? And talking of Ouija boards, when I was talking to Gary Parsons just before we had our interview, he happened to mention and remind me of the fact that back in the 1970s, which was at the height of the, I suppose you'd say, the witchcraft popularity movement, when there were so many movies and books out about it, the UK games and toy manufacturers Waddingtons brought out a Ouija board for Christmas. So I suppose that would be the case of the Ghosts of Christmas Past. Just remains for me to say thank you very much for listening. We'll be back again same time next week, and until then, stay well, stay different. Good night.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. You can keep in touch with us online at www.weirdtalesradio.com, by email to weirdtales@icloud.com, and on Twitter @ChristianUncut. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Good night.
This podcast is a part of Straight Up Strange Productions. Discover more shows like this one at straightupstrange.com.